We're also waiting for the police spokesperson, Charles Owino, to join us. I know you've got lots of questions. Yesterday, two people in Cabernet, this should be in Baringo, they're dealing with gunshot wounds because of alleged police brutality. Also, those quarantine centers, if you're caught out after curfew, that's where you're taken to. Quarantine now sounds like a punishment. That's a problem for many, I'm sure. And also human rights in the era of COVID-19. That's what we'll be talking about shortly, and we'll be live on the Citizen TV Kenya Facebook page. So please go there if you want clearer sound than this, but I'll also be live streaming on my Instagram as well. See you shortly. Actually, no, see you now, because we're getting started. Irungu, you can still hear me?
I can very clearly.
Great. Okay. Well, we're counting down. Yes. Okay. Good evening, whichever part of the world you're watching us from. It is 5 p.m. in Nairobi, Kenya, and this is our weekly Facebook Live session where we talk about issues that are important to you in this era of COVID-19, the ultimate disruptor. It's changed everything in the world, and we'll be focusing on different issues around that. Last week, we spoke to sports stars. We had Eliud Kipchoge, world marathon record holder, and Victor Wanyama, an international footballer, to talk about how sports has gone on lockdown because of COVID-19. But this week, we want to talk about human rights. As the world continuously discusses what is human rights in the world that we live in, over 6 billion people occupying the same space. Some feel that because of COVID-19 and some of the laws that government have put in place, human rights are being trampled upon. That's what we want to discuss right now. We've got two guests, one who's live with me right now, another whom I'm expecting to join us shortly. But let's say hello to Irungu Houghton, Executive Director, Amnesty International. Thank you for joining us, Irungu, today.
Thank you very much, Wahiga, and good afternoon, viewers.
Good. Thank you, Irungu. We're also expecting the police spokesperson, Charles Owino. As soon as he gets on, we'll try and put him on the same screen or figure out how we can get him on phone to be able to answer some of your questions. What questions do you have about some of the new laws around COVID-19? Curfews, restrictions, where can you move, where can you go to, where can you not? Please let us know. Use the Citizen TV Kenya Facebook page. You can also, I guess, at Citizen TV Kenya on Twitter as well. Ask your questions there, and I'll be posing them to Irungu and Charles when we get him as well. But Irungu, thanks for being here with us. As someone who oversees and kind of looks at trends in human rights, both in Kenya, East Africa, and so forth, what sort of concerns are you hearing out there about human rights in 2020? What are people telling you, Irungu?
So globally, Amnesty International works in over 80 countries across the world, and there are countries that have seen greater violence as a result of policing during the pandemic. Kenya, unfortunately, is one of those countries, and we have been appalled by the numbers of fatalities, the injuries that we've seen. I think at a basic count, we're looking at 16 fatalities and close to 45 serious injuries as a result of the first 4 weeks of enforcing the curfew. And these obviously are much higher than the number of people that have died from COVID-19.
Talk to me about one or two of the issues. If we have viewers who are joining us from other parts of the world, they haven't been following the news, which of these incidents have particularly stood out for you and why?
I mean, I think the victims of unlawful police violence can be maybe broken into three or four groups of people. There are what I call the Good Samaritans, the people who were rushing people or transporting people, like, for example, the border rider that was killed at the Likoni ferry. He was essentially taking somebody to hospital. There are people like that. And the second category really are, sadly, our children. I mean, the sad case of Saddam, who was beaten, survived, very injured. And of course, the one that I think really for many of us will be the face of policing during the pandemic. And that's the 13-year-old Yasin Moyo that was killed in the first few days of the curfew in Kiamaiko here in Nairobi. The third group are health workers. These are people who essentially are our frontline defense against COVID-19. And we've had numerous cases of health workers who were beaten. The case of the gentleman from Busia, who was beaten, and his story was all over Facebook for a few days. And I think one of our concerns is really that the definition of critical and essential services should have included very clear guidelines on a number of issues. The first is that lawyers and human rights advocates and the Independent Policing Oversight Authority should be allowed to move during the curfew period. That would have saved a number of cases. Yesterday, I heard of a terrible case of a university student here in Nairobi who had rushed to the hospital and was killed by police officers just as he arrived, just before he entered the hospital looking for medicine. So I think the first thing is to extend the list of critical and emergency services. The second thing that could be done is there are a number of cases of transporters, public service vehicles, who carry people who are already listed as critical and essential services. They drop, for example, doctors and nurses at the hospitals,
yes,
and then they can't get back. They can't leave because they don't have any documentation to show that this is the case. And I think what we do need to see now is for some documentation to be that they are able to do.
Sorry, Rungu, we seem to have missed the last part of what you said. You hang. I think the signal had an issue. Just summarize.
I was simply saying that for people who are transporting health workers, for example, they need to have documentation that allow them to drop the health workers and then get home or to their next client safely. These two measures would be very important at this time.
Okay, and Irungu, Charles Owino will be joining us shortly. We just patching him in so that he can be a part of this conversation. But when I spoke to him earlier, he had a question for me. He said we have about 120,000 police officers. The ones in the news, the ones who commit these sorts of atrocities, at least if you count in terms of newspaper headlines, could not be more than 100 or 200. But he says the whole police force gets the flack for the actions of a few. How do you respond to a perspective like that?
I think there are two things. First of all, as Amnesty International and I think the entire human rights community, we would love a time when 120,000 police officers acted lawfully, they protected us, and we could call on them as human rights defenders, which is essentially the oath that they take and the principles that were enshrined in the Constitution that gave rise to the police service post-2010. But I think the reality is this, is that every officer who beats citizens with their batons, who shoots recklessly into a crowd, who tear gases large crowds at this moment, cannot be excused. I think they have to be brought to a court of law, they have to be interdicted, and they have to be held personally accountable. And if that does not happen, then their commanding officers need to be held accountable for that. And I don't think it's excusable to say that it is the work of a few officers. I would love to have a victim's family, have the father of Yasin Moyo here on this show and ask him whether he would excuse the officer that took the life of his 13-year-old child, and that somehow that this was just some terrible mistake. So I think, no, the law must be followed, not just for Yasin Moyo, but even for the police sergeant in Muranga who was killed, bludgeoned to death by police officers in the first week of the curfew. He was an officer that had more than 30 years of distinguished service to this country, had retired. He was now running a butchery and delayed getting home that first week in the curfew, and they beat him to death. So I think as Amnesty, we would hold not just the rights of civilians, but also the rights of officers and retired officers in this moment. And we have gone on record saying two things. One is that all police officers must be issued protective personal equipment at this time. They must not be asked to police in a manner in which endangers themselves and their families and the public. And secondly, also, I think it is important to recognize that at this time, people are anxious, they are fearful, and essentially beating them into submission will not help the war against COVID-19.
Very interesting points that you've raised there, Irungu, and thank you for bringing up the case of Yasin. And of course, hopefully at a later date on a session like this one, we could have the dad to come in and speak about the loss that he's gone through and any excuses that those would give about the behavior of the police, what his response would be to that. Has Amnesty Kenya or international given any directives or guidelines on people who are arrested or picked up outside of their homes after curfew and forcefully put into quarantine zones, because that is causing quite a lot of an outcry by Kenyans out there in terms of what they are seeing in our quarantine centers?
We have spoken throughout this period. In fact, I think one of the things that shocks me is the number of open letters, statements, and private conversations we have had with duty bearers in this last 1 month. It's probably more than the first quarter of the year, to be honest. On the issue of distance-conscious policing, and this is an important term I think we need to think about, is the manner of policing that was possible before COVID-19 just will not work in a COVID-19 period. So we released 7 guidelines privately, first of all, in a letter to the Inspector General on the 1st of April, and then we published them with I think it was about 20 organizations on the 4th of April. And those 7 guidelines essentially would give guidance to the police service on how to do human rights-based policing at this time. On the issue of mandatory quarantine centers, we are on record with the Kenya Ethical, Legal and Issues Network, a human rights organization that focuses on the right to health, that the first experience of the mandatory quarantine centers fell far short of the WHO guidelines and standards. They also fell short of the Ministry of Health own guidelines. And just to give you some examples, many of the people, the 2,000 people that were put into mandatory quarantine initially, were not essentially supervised. They were left on their own in a number of cases, like the KMTC or the Lenana school mandatory centers. They were not given enough food. They were not given enough spacing. Many of those beds were less than 2 meters apart. And I think, in many ways, we have a lot to learn from those mandatory centers. And I'm very glad to see that a number of those centers have now been closed down. But I think we need to think in terms of what will happen when, or if, let me not predict this, but if the COVID-19 spreads rapidly to the counties, how will we set up mandatory quarantine centers that do not violate the principle of physical distancing and a sense of decency and dignity? But coming back to the police, I think there is another issue. I'm just hoping that police spokesperson Charles Owino is watching this now so he can respond. What has been really shocking recently in the last week has been how the specific officers have used the mandatory quarantine centers as a way of getting around the instruction by the National Council on the Administration of Justice not to congest our cells, our police cells. We've had cases, some of them more notable than others, where people have been arrested and essentially put in the mandatory quarantine centers if they cannot pay 2,000 shillings in bribes. And I think, if there is an example of how we can endanger the public, and secondly also undermine Ministry of Health guidelines, this is it. And I think I'm very glad to see that Mr. Echo, one of the people that was on national television just recently, I was very happy to hear that he had been released after public uproar and outrage. But I really hesitate to say that this is the case for everybody. I think what we're seeing essentially is instead of being able to charge petty offenders, as was the case in 2019, 2 million people were arrested on petty offenses, and if they didn't pay bribes, many of them ended up in our judicial, our criminal justice system. What we're seeing now is the mandatory quarantine centers are being used for another purpose.
Let me ask you this, Irungu, because I know your scope goes beyond the borders of Kenya. We have heard of such incidents in Uganda. I think I also heard of similar incidents, concerns about excessive use of force by police in, should have been Rwanda or Burundi as well. When you look across the African continent, is there a country that you believe is doing this right? is, on one hand, really trying to fight COVID-19, but on the other hand, honoring human rights at a time like this?
I think there are a number of countries that are doing very well on different fronts. I think Botswana is doing excellent in terms of taking the issue of quarantine seriously. I think some of your viewers will know that even the president was placed under 14-day isolation by the Minister of Health, and this was announced publicly. And I think that level of decision that nobody is above the law is really critical. In the Kenyan case, we have heard stories of the children and the wives and husbands of muheshimiwas and so on, who were not essentially accorded the same discipline that is given to all civilians. We listened to the statement by the President of the Republic of South Africa, Cyril Ramaphosa, who spoke very early on about the need for humane policing at this time. And he said, I do not give you a license to beat people. Now, unfortunately, in the case of South Africa, we did see violence. And this has been the case in places like Uganda. And in Tanzania, the major concern, I think, has been really the protection of the media and the right of journalists to be able to speak truthfully and report accurately about what's happening at this time. So I think, the human rights records of many governments are being tested at this time. And whether or not where we are as a country, as Kenyans, on this spectrum,
yes,
it is no excuse to say that this country X is worse than us and therefore we're doing better. I think we have to be judged on our own merits. And in particular, we have to recognize that the Constitution has not been suspended at this point. That document is still a protecting force for all civilians and all Kenyans at this time.
Okay, thank you so much, Irungu, for that. And hang on, because we can now bring in Charles Owino, the police spokesperson. Spokesperson, I trust you can hear me loud and clear?
Yes, I can.
Great. I can't hear you too well, but I know that will be sorted shortly. Thank you for joining us for this discussion. I don't know if you caught any of it, but I'm sure you've seen the reports by institutions like Human Rights Watch, concerns about people who've lost their lives during night curfews, people who've been injured because of the use of excessive force, like what we saw in Baringo yesterday, allegations that 2 gentlemen were shot by a police officer. They are currently recuperating in hospital. Your thoughts about concerns by many that police are using excessive force at a time like this, spokesperson?
Thank you so much. I think it is the interest of all of us that each and every person follows laws and regulations as stipulated, including police officers, and nobody stands above the law. We are at a very difficult moment, not just in Kenya, but globally, on issues of COVID-19. But that does not give an excuse for any person to do what is not right. Basically, as a police service, we have mechanisms that we use to manage in discipline. We are a very large family, a family of about 120,000 people, and therefore we cannot deny in 1 or 2 incidents you would find situations where individual police officers may be found culpable for having undertaken actions that are not appropriate. But we must be very careful when we are highlighting some of these issues on the language that we use, because I've told you we have 120,000 policemen. When you say police are violating human rights, you would be implying there are 120,000 police officers. And what it means is that sometimes you may demoralize other officers who are working so hard and are so disciplined. And that is why we insist on ensuring that we talk about individual police officers. And our regulations are very clear. As policemen, we don't take collective responsibility. We take individual responsibility, and we don't encourage any officer to do what is wrong. What is perturbing is that, for example, what has been highlighted most was an incident that took place in Mombasa, where some people were beaten up by policemen on the first day of the curfew.
Not just one incident, to be fair.
Just a minute.
Okay.
And the Inspector General took action. But that is what they have been, you people, the media has been highlighting, almost all media houses have been highlighting that in and out. But if we have other individual cases, they take individual actions. For example, you remember during this curfew restriction period, we have had 2 ugly incidents, one in Kilifi, and one in Kwale, where police officers were caught in camera, individual policemen obtaining bribes. And the Inspector General sacked them summarily from work. And that is why I want to encourage every Kenyan that if there's a policeman somewhere in the deeper part of Baringo or the deeper part of Kilifi or Kwale or Mandera who thinks that he can just go and harass an individual Mwananchi, we are encouraging every Mwananchi that please support us by ensuring that you can be able even to take a video of an action of an officer who is doing a wrong thing. Because we may not be there. We humbly request each and every Kenyan, because there are some rogue people that they may think that if he's deep in Kwale or he's deep in Baringo, nobody will see him. If we get such like person, such like officers, you will deal with them harassing common Mwananchi, yes, we are going to take very, 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 very serious action against them, and we don't encourage any officer to do what is not
fair enough. Spokesperson, I must let you know Irungu Houghton, Executive Director, Amnesty International, is on the line. I'll give him a chance to pose a question to you shortly. Also, we are live on Facebook, and people are sending questions, which I shall allow you to answer in just a bit. But tell me this. You said, let's not talk about the police. Let's talk about individuals who commit a crime within the police service. But yes, to the father of Yasin, a young person who lost their life at a time like this, when they see a person in uniform, it doesn't matter what they look like. They immediately recall what happened to them. Some would say it's not fair for you to say that at a time when people are grieving. How do you respond to that, spokesperson?
What I'm saying is the police is a social institution. The police is supposed to be there for the good of every person, for the good of all of us. But as usual in a large family where we are, I've always given an example of a bishop who is preaching in a church, and his son has decided to smoke bang and he's been arrested. You cannot come up and say, because your son is smoking bang, you cannot come and preach for us as a bishop for our church. So what I'm saying is, yes, we make mistakes. Individual police officers make mistakes, but
mistakes that cost lives.
What we should concentrate on is ensuring that these individual officers are dealt with and disciplined accordingly. But again, remember, I've always said this, that we are not going to get policemen from outside the jurisdiction of our republic. And what it means is that if we set the public against the police blindly without being moderate in how we report on the police, then what happens is that we keep on widening the gap of trust between the police and the public. So even the few police officers who have done well will not be seen in that light. And when that gap is there, who suffers? Is the common Mwananchi who suffers, not the police as individuals.
Okay, let me bring in Irungu. Thank you, spokesperson, for that. Irungu, you've listened to what he's had to say. Let me get your responses.
So first of all, I'd like to agree with the spokesperson, wholeheartedly. Two things. One is that there should be no space, no area, geographical area on this republic that would leave police officers feeling comfortable to violate human rights. And I'm glad to hear this from the police spokesperson on behalf of the Inspector General. I think the second, and this I think has also been said by His Excellency, the President of the Republic of Kenya, on at least 2 occasions since the killing of Yasin Moyo, that stern action will be taken against officers. The second thing really is his encouragement to everybody to come out and report. In many cases, according to I think it was the Economic Survey, less than 5% of Kenyans report crimes to the police. Now, the reason for that is that there is a real breakdown in trust and confidence that they will not be violated, they will not be asked for bribes or extorted. But I think the key thing there is that the more we report as a republic, the more there is the opportunity for actions to take place. The fact that we have 16 cases that are currently being studied by the Independent Police Oversighting Authority, the Kenya National Commission for Human Rights Commission, the Internal Affairs Unit. This is because people have had the courage to come forward, and others have had the courage to essentially be witnesses to the violence that they have seen. And I think this is a critical point that the spokesperson has said. I think the other point that I think needs to be stated is these are not just isolated actions. There is a culture, there is a context in which officers feel that they can get away with brutalizing other citizens. And I think that's what the Inspector General and the National Police Service need to address themselves to now. Is it that there is inadequate human rights training? Is it that the vetting of the officers is not done properly? Or is it simply that the actions that are taken when officers commit human rights violations are not sufficiently harsh enough? Just to give you an example, we have just heard the spokesperson say that 2 officers have been sacked, and I think on the previous occasion that we were speaking, he talked about 4 officers that have been interdicted. These are 6 in total, and I believe the 2 that were suspended possibly are for the same case. My question back to the spokesperson would be, in the 16 cases or more that are very well documented in the public domain, what is the action that has been taken on this? And then I'd like to come back with a letter from an 8-year-old.
A letter from an 8-year-old. Okay, spokesperson, you've had that question. Of those 16 cases that I think you referred to when you're making your opening statements, what action has been carried out? But also, someone on Twitter asked this: what would it take to build a largely, I'm trying to look for the right words, empathetic police service here in Kenya, viewed as empathetic, because perception is everything here, spokesperson, and how can the public support this? Go ahead, spokesperson.
First of all, when actions that we take is, number one, all persons have a right to defend themselves. So even for a case where you have witnessed murder, a person committing murder, you still have to arrest the person, process him, check his mental status, take him to court, and let him be prosecuted and a verdict be given. Even for those who have committed crimes, or police officers who have violated in lines of discipline, we take them through a process. For example, now we are lucky, since the promulgation of the Constitution, that we actually requested the Clicker Commission, and eventually we managed to get the Independent Civilian Oversight Authority, which supports us in terms of investigations and recommendations that are given by IPOA or given by the Internal Affairs Unit to the Office of the Inspector General. We take actions. So for those officers that will be found gullible and that they can be charged for criminal offenses following actions that they took, would be charged in the court of law in accordance to the recommendations made by the 2 institutions, the DPP.
Okay.
The question on empathy. First of all, we must ask ourselves one question. Did we just wake up in the morning and find people have respect for medical doctors? Do we just have respect for engineers or for teachers and for the rest? First of all, it's attitude. What is the general public attitude towards the police service? How many of us would want their children to become policemen? And if not so many would want their children to become policemen, you must ask yourself, why don't they want their children to become policemen? Why would somebody want to become a military officer? Generally, you find that the interest of individuals wanting to become military officers is many a times higher than people wanting to become police officers. Ask yourself those questions. As a civil servant in office, I may not have an answer for you. I take it back to the public. Make your police attractive, and you know how to make it attractive. Once the police becomes attractive, it will attract the best brains, it will attract the best people, and the majority will be the best that you can get. And for that reason, when we make police attractive and we also empathize with the policemen, I think we'll get a good result.
So at the moment, the police service is not attractive. Can we conclude that? And thus might not attract the caliber?
It depends on individuals. Personally, as a person, I had always wanted to be a policeman. I think I have a record for that. I like my job as a policeman, and I'm very passionate of what I do as a policeman, not only as a commander in the field, but also as a spokesperson for the police. But it depends with motivation. There's that individual motivation, but there's also that general public perception. The general public perception about police is poor, and we must improve on it.
Irungu asked a question which I will rephrase to you. He essentially asked, since you cannot, the kind of changes you're asking for would take quite a long time to sort of make
I've not asked for any changes.
Okay. the proposal you've given. You've not asked for changes, but you've given an idea.
Proposal.
Okay.
It's a food for thought for you. And let me tell you, if you are honest with me,
yes,
yourself and even Irungu, I don't think the profession you want your children to be is to become policemen. I am sure. And you must tell me why.
My question...
Perhaps I can jump in there.
Okay, Irungu is answering you.
And the angels in heaven. I know majority of you would not want their children to become policemen, and you know why. So the answer is on you, not on me.
Let me just...
Okay, let Irungu come in. Go ahead, Irungu.
Spokesperson. First of all, I would be extremely proud if any of my children took up policing as a profession. And I say this on national television. I hope they are watching. I would be extremely proud. As Amnesty, we hold that police officers are human rights defenders. They are essentially the first port of call for all people in distress. And there is absolutely nothing more honorable than being available to serve the public at a time when you are vulnerable, you are not safe, and you need protection. And I suspect they would be great officers. But let me come back to a conversation I had with about 20 children on Friday evening. And the 20 children invited me to speak to their class through Zoom. And one of the things that they wanted to learn from me was, why do police officers beat and kill people? And it literally was that question. And we spent 20 minutes on that conversation with them. And the project is called Polite Policing. It's a hashtag Polite Policing. It generated some homework, and the children over the weekend wrote letters. And they were, again, 28-year-old children. They wrote letters to the family of Yassin Moyo. And yesterday, I had the privilege with my colleagues to take those letters to Mama Yassin and Baba Yassin, and for them to read them. And it was very moving. In fact, as I tell the story, I still feel that emotion. And one of the things that I was struck by when we had the conversation on Friday was, before I read you a letter that is to the Inspector General, that they've also written, was how they asked very direct questions. So one of the questions was, why do police officers laugh and enjoy beating young people? Why doesn't Uhuru Kenyatta fire the police officers immediately they are caught doing this? And I wondered, if it is so clear for an 8-year-old, why is it not clear for some of us who are in our 40s and 50s to take the action that is required to keep all of us safe? I'd like to, if I can, with permission, Wahiga, just read the letter of one of these students.
Briefly, if you can. Then Charles
It's a very short letter.
Okay.
And it says, it's dated the 20th of April, 2020. Dear Mr. Hilary Muchambai, my name is Kisha. I go to Kyoto School and I'm 8 years old. I was very sad when I saw in the news that the police were beating people. I was even more sad when I heard that a 13-year-old boy called Yassin Moyo was shot by mistake by the police. I'm writing this letter to ask you to talk to the police and to ask them to stop hurting people and to protect them. May God bless you. Yours faithfully, Kisha. We have many letters like this from children, and I hope at an opportunity that I can come to Vigilance House and share them. And I share these letters not to ridicule the officers or to ridicule the police service, but just to say that, you know, Kenyans, even at the age of 8, are vigilant. They want a polite policing service, is the way they call it. They want police officers who are kind, not police officers that are mean. And I think lastly, if I can just stop there, is just to say that the spokesperson has not answered my question on what actions have been taken on the 16 fatalities we've seen with and the 50 or so injuries. Do we have any other cases of suspension or dismissal of officers?
Great. Thank you, Irungu, for that. Charles, you've had that last question.
I'm not clear on it.
Yes, he's asked 16. Irungu, you have a record of 16 who've lost their lives since the curfew began. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct, yes.
Yes. Charles, do you agree with that number? And what action has been taken against some of those officers? I know you mentioned a few, but some of the others.
I will not say yes and no, because I'm an officer of the law and I must be quite objective to the rule of law. Mm-hmm. When persons die in circumstances that it is suspected that a person has committed a crime, for example, that a person has been killed. If there is direct evidence that a particular person has killed another, then automatically we process the person to be charged, whether he's a policeman or not. But in circumstances where it is not clear that a particular person has killed another, but there are allegations against that, then we subject these inquiries into inquest so that it can be determined by the court of law if a person is gullible or not. And we have a number of cases where even police officers have been taken through inquest, and eventually deaths of individuals have been taken through inquest and recommendations made, officers charged and even convicted. So I'm not in a position at this time to have that record.
You can't give us exact details.
Yeah, but that is the objective procedure. But if you allow me, I want to go back to that situation of that child who wrote a letter.
Yes.
To the Inspector General, concerned about people who are beaten. It is equally important to take such a child back to the role of the police. And it is also important to remind people it is true that policemen can justifiably use their firearms and kill someone. It's not good to lie to people and tell them that the policemen can never use their firearms against an individual. It's important to remind people that there are circumstances when it is justifiable. Because, for example, you meet a robber in town here with an AK-47. You don't expect that robber to shoot the police leg or his hand or shoot in the air. Most likely this person is out not just to kill the policeman, but to kill any other person who will stand on his way. And we have very many cases where people have been killed. And I can remind you that sometimes in the early 70s, the policemen in Kenya were not even using firearms. The policemen in Kenya were using batons until when the armed robberies started in town, people stealing from the banks and robbing using firearms. So circumstances brought all this. But that does not mean that a policeman can also just use his firearm against people. I've said police is a social duty, a social responsibility. We are not supposed to have conflicts with members of the public. We are supposed to support members of the public. And that is why we would be very difficult for any police officer who misuses his firearm against an individual.
Okay.
And that is why I'm still also saying that in that process, let us also try to empathize also with the police, work with the police, have a good relationship with the police as much as possible, because we will never have policemen from outside. It is only our police. And make sure that as a society we play a role. And I always say the first role that we play, give us the best children to become policemen.
Which is why my last question at the end of this discussion will be, do you as police feel safe in the case, in this era of COVID-19? Are your family safe as well? That's a question I'm coming to. But there was a question that Irungu had asked you that I want you to answer before I look at the feedback. We have a lot of SMSs or messages on Facebook that I'll try and read as many of them as is possible. Having looked at the increasing number of cases we're hearing of excessive use of force by police, as spokesperson, is it time for a refresher training? Is it time for an assessment of the mental health of the police that are out there? Is it time to, sort of put everyone back to check where they are? That's a question that was posed to you, spokesperson.
As much as the life or health of a single individual is as important as 100 or 200, but I would commendably say the percentage of officers who have misbehaved are still very few. I don't reiterate it to training. Police officers are well trained. We take a lot of time to train them. I'm lucky. I've been a trainer before for about 5 years. And I think that we
in
train
a nutshell,
officers.
What does that training entail? Sorry, as you carry on, what does that training entail for our viewers? Go ahead.
The police training entails everything. The basic police training is to learn about basic laws. And because you see, police officers are officers of the law. Their duty is to enforce laws and regulations. So policemen learn a lot about basic law. And one of the other serious components of training of police is based on human rights, because the policeman is the human rights defender number one. The man who protects you from not losing your single cow in the cowshed is the policeman. The man who protects you from somebody not stealing from your shop is the policeman. The man who protects you from your neighbor who is aggressive, who wants to use a panga to cut you, is a policeman. Therefore, the human rights defender, listen, the human rights defender number one is a policeman, and therefore all policemen must be taken through human rights training to ensure that they are going to defend the rights and the basic rights of individual Kenya. But we must agree that, as it is said, every market has a mad person. I don't know whether that is still there as it used to be there before. But we are not going to take that outrightly. And also, equally, we are a large population. As a large population, you will not miss one or two people that even if you train them, no matter what you do, they would become erratic and so on and so forth. Equally, this job is quite stressful. Most police officers live away from home. We are not like teachers. Most police officers live away from their families. Most police officers still don't earn so highly. And you find that there's a lot of pressure on police officers like any other person. And in the process, and most police officers also face very disturbing scenes. It is the police officer to arrive at the scene of accident. It's the police officer to carry the body. And therefore, we must admit that police officers may also find themselves in situations where, in the process of work, some of them may develop conditions that may not be very favorable. Okay. And therefore, I would say that all these things combined, if we agree, then we continue supporting ourselves, we continue widening the space of democracy in our country. Okay. We continue training more police officers, but we cannot say that they are not properly trained. Okay. Police officers are properly trained.
Thank you, spokesperson. I have about another 15 minutes or so, so I want to get through as many messages as possible. This is live on Facebook, and we're getting so many messages that I need to highlight at this time. One of them, which I saw a bit earlier, Irungu, someone wants to know how to get that letter. So I don't know if you're going to post it on your Twitter or on your Instagram, and they can go and read it there at Irungu Horton. But these are some of the questions that are going out there, spokesperson and Irungu. Lucy Koyama is saying, what are we doing wrong as Kenyan citizens that is making our police force get frustrated? Let's obey the law, period. Make their work easier. So spokesperson, someone in support of what the police are doing. Nyamogo is saying, annual mandatory medical examination is critical to ensure that officers who serve at the National Police Service are healthy because they are faced with lots of challenges of life, both from work and their families. Let me see here. Dan Jets is saying mental health training, very vital for armed forces. David Mushemi is saying, I think some of these police act out of depression and pressure from their bosses, especially targeting bribes collection as required by their bosses. Spokesperson, you can talk a bit about that, bribes collection as required by seniors. Christine Saru is asking, how is it the responsibility of citizens and not police to make the police service attractive, when a huge part of the negative public perception is the doing of the police themselves? So the police are solely responsible for fixing their image, so they are the ones who should take charge of that. Let me read one more. Makalia Mwikali says, yes, the police service is not attractive. Our impression towards them has been shattered. It might take a lot of effort on their end and hours to change it. Someone is asking, spokesperson, someone is asking about low pay, poor housing. What effect does that have on police officers? While someone is questioning the recruitment process of police officers. Is that why we don't get the right caliber? While someone is saying here, how many Kenyans will have to suffer before the police accept that there is a big problem? And there are so many others that people are posing. Irungu, I can let you have a word in before spokesperson goes ahead to give us some responses.
So there are a couple of questions that I think have come to us. The first one is, where do you report to? I would invite viewers to go to the Amnesty Twitter handle. There we have posted our own telephone numbers, but we have also posted the telephone numbers of the Kenya National Commission for Human Rights. And we would also encourage them to use the Independent Policing Oversight Authority helplines, which are on their Twitter handle, their Facebook page, and their website. There are a number of these are reliable places to report to. The second question that I think was raised, which I think is an important one, is, and I think the spokesperson has begun to talk about it a little bit, is the importance of closing the gap between civilians and the police. And at a time like this, that gap is crucial. In my own neighborhood, we have reached out to the local police station, and we have protocols and agreements that if somebody needs to be taken to emergency healthcare, there are phone calls that can be made, and that person will be escorted to make sure that people are safe during this time. This can be replicated all over the country. I'd like to also just point out in the same neighborhood of Yasin Moyo, Kiamaiko here in Nairobi, Mama Rahma of the Kiamaiko Social Justice Center, when she saw the tension between the community and the police service after the death of Yasin Moyo, she took it upon herself to reach out to the officers in her jurisdiction. And for a couple of weeks, they did joint patrols. And I think this is something that the spokesperson and indeed the Inspector General and other senior officers could make an appeal. There's no reason why police at this point should be the only system that is really encouraging people to observe the curfew. We can have joint patrols by community leaders, civic leaders, human rights organizations. I think are on record as far back as the 25th of March, at least in the case of Amnesty, that we were willing to work with the police service during the evenings to make sure that there is a joint civil police approach to keeping people at home, and it would reduce the tension between us, between civilians and the police.
Very interesting ideas that you've raised. Spokesperson, can you respond to that? Maybe it's time for the police to, partner with other stakeholders so that the blame is never always on the police, especially in regards to curfew. But there's a message here from someone who says that they are a police officer who is also a clinical officer, Samuel Mukua, who says we are actually frustrated. We are not even recognized in the service. So much frustration. Okay, spokesperson, go ahead.
I don't know which one to start with, whether I start with the frustrated officer or...
maybe you could start with this, Samuel, this police officer who says they are very frustrated and even recognition is an issue.
Police service is a service to the people, and many a times officers with specialized training, like officers who have done clinical medicine and the rest, we always give them opportunities to be placed in various departments. But basically, when you are recruited as a policeman, the first thing is that we ensure that you get to understand the basic knowledge of police work before you are even deployed to your professional places. We have officers, for example, who are advocates of High Court, and many a times we would prefer to deploy them in different areas so that they learn the standard procedures. That in event that they now go to the legal department, they understand how policemen operate, and they don't cease to be policemen. They continue being policemen. So this particular individual policeman, I don't know for how long he has been in service and why he could not have been maybe placed. Also, we have cases of indiscipline where officers have very good papers, but they are so indisciplined that it's very difficult to deploy them in certain areas. So that also brings a problem. But I may think that this could be a different case, and if we have particulars of this kind of officer, we'll be able to find out exactly how he's placed, where he's placed, and why he's not placed in the right place.
I think one of the questions I really want you to answer, spokesperson, is whose primary responsibility is it to make the police look attractive? Is it not the police themselves?
We have a role to play, and
I think you have the biggest role, I would say.
Yeah, no, we have a role to play. You know, there are so many things. We don't determine conditions and terms of service for the police service, do we?
No, you don't, but if you don't...
Yes. So that is number one. Number two, you remember there was a year after the promulgation of the Constitution when we even decided to improve on minimum level of education. Actually, we took it just to a level of seaplane. And you remember the kind of response we got, especially from Parliament. And Parliament demanded, and we had to reduce the level of education of people recruited into police to a level of D+ and below. So sometimes we don't determine some of these areas, but we have a big role to play. Hello?
Okay.
Hello?
Yes, we are.
Are you with me?
We
Yes,
are still with you.
We have a big role
Go
to
ahead.
play as individual police officers. We have a very, very big role to play in terms of making our job attractive. And I believe some of us from where we sit or from villages where we come, as individuals, I think we have made the job more attractive. But equally, the Kenyans themselves must have an attitude.
Okay. Even as we wrap up this discussion, the quarantine, the mandatory quarantine, many are saying that structure is being used to punish. Some is being used as a punishment, spokesperson. And I've seen it's one of the questions that's coming up quite a bit. If the police, this one is from Robert Mwakio asking, if the police keep filling the quarantine facilities with offenders, what will happen when real sick people start needing facilities and beds? How do you respond to that? A very real concern right now, spokesperson.
Wahiga, can I jump in just before the spokesperson speaks?
Okay,
just
Charles, hold on. Let Irungu say something. Go ahead, Irungu.
And with respect to the spokesperson, I think this is a critical issue. My question to the police service at this point is, given the abuse of this facility and the danger that it poses to the public health, can we have a categorical statement that people who are found after curfew or during the curfew will not be taken to mandatory quarantine centers? There's no reason for this at all, neither scientifically nor legally. But secondly, that they will be processed with accordance to the Public Health Act that simply says, or the guidelines that were released by the Ministry of Health, that says that they would be fined on the spot and allowed to go back to their, or rather, they would be allowed to go home. The idea of holding people for 14 days is actually even unconstitutional, given the rights of accused and arrested persons. Can we have a statement from the police service that this will not occur in future? Okay.
I want to get Charles on the line for that, to be able to answer that statement. But even as we wrap up, okay, Charles, we have you. I trust you can still hear me. A question here from Irungu that I want us to finish with. He is asking for the police service to issue a statement, a promise to Kenyans, that any Kenyan who is found outside their premises or their homes after curfew will simply be fined and sent on their way, as opposed to the mandatory quarantine, which is opening citizens up to greater danger. Is that a promise you can give, spokesperson?
No, I cannot give that promise. And let me tell you something.
Yes.
Some of these issues border morality.
Border morality?
Yes, they border morality. For example, we go to a pub and we find 20 people drinking.
Yes.
You ask yourself, these 20 people, if by chance one of them had COVID-19, the chances is maybe all the 20 have been infected. And from that minute, they'll move to their houses and infect their families and many other people on the way. Now, which is the best moral situation? When you get these 20.
But cramming them in a quarantine,
just a minute, let me finish.
Them in a quarantine facility is no alternative.
I'm putting a question.
Go ahead.
When you get these 20, which is the most fair thing for the nation and for everybody? Take them for quarantine or release them to go back and infect their families? It's a moral question.
My question is, when you take them, if you pick up 100 individuals in Nairobi today, you take them to quarantine facilities.
No, you are going too far. That's a different case. We have not picked 100. And I can also tell you, we don't lack space. We can even create a new quarantine, if it means saving Kenyans. If you ask me honestly, we can create other schools, open up other schools to quarantine people, if that is what it would mean. Because why would we get 20 of you in a pub disobeying the law, and we are not sure whether one of you is infected, then we release you back to your families. It is immoral for us to do that. You better go for quarantine.
Irungu, you've been asked which one you'd pick there.
That is my position as Owino.
Okay.
But it borders a moral question. And let the public and any other person judge the two of us in that question.
Irungu, do you see sense in that thought there, in that moral question posed by spokesperson?
I think you can't police by morality. I think this is the key issue. It's either a legal question or not. And the Constitution is very clear that we set up the rights of accused and arrested persons to essentially be held for only 24 hours. And secondly, that they must be brought to a court of law. Now, obviously, COVID is a difficult time, and I sympathize, let me also say, with the police service in those cases where Kenyans, can we call them COVIDiots, are not following the public health guidelines. So I, for one, would never essentially advocate for people to break the guidelines that have been set down for us. It is extremely important that we all observe them at this time. But I think what our major concern is that individual officers are making a determination, and the key word I think from the inspector, the police inspector, the spokesperson, was if. The police officers have no clue whether any of those 20 people in the bar had COVID. My question would be whether this should be referred back to the National Task Force for determination, including the use of testing to ensure that we are not simply putting people into mandatory quarantine with other people who may have COVID-19. And this is the major danger. And I fear that the police service may find itself at the end of several public interest suits by citizens who said, I was negative, I had no symptoms when I went in, I was put into 14 days quarantine, and maybe I had on my costs, and I came out with COVID-19. And I think that's really the crux of it. So I would say stick with the law. Where there is no clarity, request guidance from the Ministry of Health on this issue, and let's not deal in immorality.
Okay. Spokesperson, I'm going to give you the final word because we're really out of time. I'm told there's one question we need to just pick up. This one is from, let me see here, which one? Oh, Abdul Haj. Somebody's here saying Kenyans need to understand police officers are human beings like another. Let's not blame them. Sometimes we put ourselves in the wrong knowingly, like the Kenyans who jumped from the KMTC fence and risked innocent lives. I don't know if there's any other that I've missed. Okay, spokesperson, I think why don't you just respond to what Irungu has said, even as you wrap up, and even as you tell me how safe are the police at a time like this with COVID-19 affecting police forces around the world, and your police are out at night. I don't know how many are wearing masks. I don't know how many are keeping social distancing. I don't know how many know the symptoms, should they need to be tested. Maybe that's how we can wrap up, even as you respond to what Irungu had to say.
First of all, every person is at risk, but police and health workers are on the front line. They understand that they are at a greater risk. Many institutions have come forward to support us. Many people have donated for us hand wash systems. Many have donated for us face masks. Many have brought ethanol and so on and so forth. So we are grateful to the rest of Kenyans that have been concerned on the role of the police officers and the risk at which they are. So we know we are at risk, and every person is at risk. What I can say is that we have a moral standing as citizenry of this country, that we have a duty to protect ourselves. We have a duty to protect our neighbors. And therefore, it is important that we avoid unnecessary conflict. It is important that we obey the regulations, that it is important that if we have curfew orders, let's try our level best to obey them. Because what will save us is not the cat and mouse game. It's not the blame game. What will save us is individual responsibility. I request all of us to behave responsible, know that we are at risk, and try to sort out this matter as fast as possible so that we can open up our country once more.
You've really spoken about what you'd like to see from the public at a time like this. What would you want to see from the police force as a spokesperson at a time like this? From your members, speak to your members who are listening.
What is most important is a sense of responsibility and the use of common sense. Police officers are supposed to, at this time, use their common sense at most. For example, if you find a person in a probox at night, and this person says, I'm from a chemist, I'm from buying drugs, every one of us, or a few of us, should be able to know what these drugs are for. And you know very well that we have conditions, like heart conditions, that if you fail to take the drugs, you can be in trouble. And therefore, it's important for all policemen at this particular time to make use of their common sense, even in areas where they are not under instructions, to ensure that they support each and every citizen. It is important for police officers to understand that the citizens will come closer to us if we offer them support. And the duty that we have been given by the Constitution of this Republic is to ensure that we support each and every citizenry where possible. And they should also know that we are not taking it lightly. If you are found on the wrong side of the law, then you have yourself to blame.
Okay. Is there a number? Irungu has already given us a number that you can reach out to if you've experienced any form of sort of excessive force by the police. Spokesperson, is there a number that someone can call the police directly to complain about one officer or one incident? Or how can they reach?
Well, we have numbers, and they can check. For example, those even you can be able to help them by googling and giving the numbers for the Internal Affairs Unit, and for the I don't have them offhand, and numbers for IPOA. We have very good number. We have numbers, and Internal Affairs Unit even have pre-toll numbers, and they have numbers that you can even send SMS, and they'll get the complaint, and they'll be able to reach you. But otherwise, you should be able to raise your complaints to the nearest senior-most police officer around your area of jurisdiction.
And it is hoped that that police officer is not the one harassing you. Thank you, police spokesperson, for joining us for this. And I hope next week, should we need to talk to you again, we'll be able to get you on the different shows that we do. And of course, Irungu Houghton, Executive Director, Amnesty International, thank you for coming to shed light. People want to see those poems, so I don't know where you're going to post them. Some of the letters that those young people that you spoke to.
I can just mention that they've already just been tweeted by Amnesty Kenya. They can be found on our timeline. Thank you very much for having us both.
Thank you so much, Irungu. Thank you, Charles, as well. And thank you to...
My regards to Irungu.
Oh, Irungu, Charles is
saying...
Tell him
we love him so much. He's doing a good job.
Thank you very much, spokesperson. All the best.
Okay, this is
Thank you.
Some form of digital handshake happening right now
all right.
on this program. Thank you so much. It has been a Citizen TV live Facebook production. We do this every Thursday, 5 p.m. And I've seen so many messages, some of which I can't read at this time. But we'll see you again next week, Thursday, same time, same place on our Facebook page as well. So stay tuned. Keep following our platforms. We'll tell you who's coming on and what's going to be happening. Thank you and goodbye from whichever part of the world you're watching us from.